There is no question that our ancestors had it hard. In the very same locations that we live in now, bears, tigers, angry mammoths, and who knows what else may have been a considerable threat to our safety if we'd been living there just a few tens of thousands of years ago. But among these terrors, there were also animals that, while perhaps deathly frightening, were also just sort of weird. In this video, we're paying tribute to some of the strangest animals our species encountered, and we'll start to identify a running theme in relation to what happened to them. The last one, if you make it that far, being a true blast from a pre-dinosaur past, so stick around for that. First, let's look at the range of animals that we have to choose from. As much as it strains our sense of divinity, humans really are just a single species of animal in a global community of anywhere between 3 and 100 million species. Now granted, most of those species are probably beetles or nematodes, and as fascinating as they can be, it's unlikely they'll make it onto a top 10 as broad as this one. But that still leaves many bizarre and wonderful creatures to choose from. And thanks to the remarkably consistent nature of our species, there are now plenty of extinct ones to choose from too. The last wild sighting of the dodo, for example, was sometime around 1662. Since then, this animal spent a long time widely being considered to have been fictional. And if it weren't for the platypus still being alive, chances are it would have been only recently that we'd have accepted that as a real animal too. So a lot has happened since then, but while 1662 seems like an eternity away from the fast-paced and relatively hygienic lives we live now, it is a drop in the ocean in terms of just how long humans have been around, and just how weird some of their non-human community members were. We all know of the saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths, but in this list we're going to try and branch out a bit from the popular, and look a little closer at some of the slightly lesser well-known animals that humans once shared their stomping grounds with. This isn't just about being the biggest or most frightening, but about being unusual. And while our first item on this list might appear to immediately contradict those terms, bear with us as we plead our case for the straight-tusked elephant. Much of what makes this animal exciting is both its enormity and how frightening that must have made it. But while we don't want those things to be the focus of this list, in the instance of the straight-tusked elephant, these are just some of the things that made it so weird. Not since Megatherium, the giant rhino-giraffe monster, who went extinct about 3 million years before the genus Homo evolved, had a mammal been as audacious as this one. Palaeoloxodon is perhaps well known to paleo-nerds, but it isn't maybe as well known to the more casual observer, on account of animals like the woolly mammoth getting all the spotlight. But for as big and epic as woolly mammoths were, the straight-tusked elephant was almost twice as heavy. Palaeoloxodon, like our own genus, emerged in Africa and migrated into Eurasia. And while they were there, their ridiculous size meant that they had very few predators. Their one major concern for the majority of their tenure on the European continent was a stocky bipedal ape called Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthals, members of our very own genus, hunted the largest mammals to walk the earth since the Miocene. And they did it with sticks and rocks, and possibly toxins as we talked about in our previous videos, but definitely sticks and rocks. So while a big elephant isn't perhaps the weirdest animal we could think of, this one gets points simply for being one of the largest animals that ever lived, particularly on land, and being such an important contribution to the success of our sister species Neanderthalensis for so many hundreds of thousands of years. Unfortunately, these elephants went extinct at around the time our species showed up on the continent. The next beast on this list is also quite a well-known one, but it's also one that is so weird it couldn't be ignored. Megatherium was a relative of the funny upside-down, algae-covered, slow-moving animals that hang from trees in South America, only it was about 1,000 times heavier than the average sloth. In 2010, a geologist with the Brazilian Geological Survey was called to check out a very unusual cave in Rhodonia. This tunnel-like cavern turned out to be one of the first discoveries of what became known as paleo burrows, and some of these are big enough to walk through. On the walls of these burrows are the characteristic ghostly claw marks of the giant sloths that once lived on the continent. These sloths were up to 6 meters in length, and they could have stood on their back legs to browse from the branches, which would have made them taller than any elephant ever known. They could get as heavy as a large African elephant at around 6 tons, And this is perhaps not as colossal as the Palaeoloxodon, but more than a woolly mammoth was in mass. And they would have been a force to behold too. While it's likely they were gentle giants, even they would have had their limits, and a powerful thumb spike suggests a capable animal with the ability to inflict serious harm on its attackers. Unless, of course, those attackers had ranged weapons. Humans wiped out giant sloths with thrown spears somewhere towards the end of the Pleistocene, around 10 to 12,000 years ago. But from the same part of the world, there's quite a choice of weird and wonderful animals. Being isolated from the rest of the planet meant that the evolutionary imaginations in South America weren't diluted or restricted by what was popular for the time. And so South America bred a menagerie of bizarre creatures for around 30 million years before it connected with North America. Glyptodonts were a good example of these. 115 million years after, the ankylosaurids evolved a tail club to bludgeon their theropod attackers with. An offshoot of the armadillo line, when faced with the same problem, came up with the same solution. The Glyptodont tail club could weigh 2 tons, and it would have come in handy when faced with the continent's apex predators, bipedal theropod dinosaurs. Before the great biotic interchange that brought North American predators down into South America to make a mess of everything, it was terror birds who were the top predators. Glyptodonts, then, these car-sized armadillos, were lumbering tanks, and animals whose phenotype harked back to the land before time. In Argentina, Glyptodont remains from as far back as 21,000 years ago show butcher marks from human tools, suggesting that their demise was likely hastened by the same forces that spelled the end of the aforementioned animals on this list. Before we branch out from the South American continent, there's one lesser-known animal that's even weirder than the ones we've covered so far. Macrauchenia pachonica thrived across South America from the Pliocene into the late Pleistocene, and it's thought to have looked like a one-ton camel with a trunk. Despite camels stemming from this part of the world, this specific camel-like creature is now thought to have been a member of its very own order of mammalian ungulates, one that no longer exists at all. This ancient order shows up just a couple of million years after the dinosaur extinction and ends, as you might have guessed by now, around the time humans showed up. Macrauchenia was one of the biggest and latest models, and it likely moved in herds, capable of rapid acceleration and speedy changes in direction, but unfortunately not agile enough to avoid the extinction forces at the end of the Pleistocene. While terror birds ruled South America, there were even larger birds in Africa. In Madagascar, for instance, there were 3-meter tall, 1-ton elephant birds stomping about. These are likely the largest birds ever known. But while they must have been very intimidating, they were thought to have not been predatory by nature. Their 10-kilo eggs and nocturnal behavior patterns would have made them quite mythical animals too, and these enormous, mostly harmless and fragile birds went extinct very recently compared with most of the things on this list, around 1,000 years ago, which meant that their presence overlapped with that of the human arrival for several hundred years. But in the end, the popularity of elephant omelette was likely what drove them to extinction too. It is impossible to stay away from the South American continent for too long when talking about strange animals. And we're going to have to go back and cover the strangest South American animal on this list, Toxodon. This savanna specialist was a 1,200-kilo rhinoceros hippo-tapir thing, and it would have reached almost 3 meters in length. Like Macrauchenia, this animal was a member of a unique and now very extinct order of animals that showed up right after the dinosaurs left, and held out all the way up to around 12,000 years ago. Toxodon platensis is the largest we know of, and it had a massive head with teeth that never stopped growing, forming tusks from the upper and lower incisors. But more than this, its molars, too, would continuously grow, suggesting that they were designed for plowing through woody forage like barks and roots. Molars that never stop growing are really weird, and don't exist in any living ungulate anymore. But they can be found in a few other strange mammal lines, namely those found in the country that was once home to the top 4 animals on this list. Australia used to be home to the strangest animals that walk the earth. It still is, but it used to, too. One of these animals was Procoptodon, the monster, short-faced kangaroo that could bite your hand off. If this triggers your pedantry response, you might be thinking that kangaroos don't walk the earth as much as hop it. But in this case, you'd be touching on another reason Procoptodon was so strange. This 2 to 3 meter marsupial was thought to have really walked around Australia, weighing around 250 kilos, and it would have reached up into the canopy of trees to pull down forage with huge hooked claws on its fingers. It wasn't just the alignment of its feet. This animal also had one key adaptation that showed for sure that it was a walker: a big butt. Large buttocks, a 3 meter reach, a short face, and a weird human-like ambulatory style make this one of the strangest animals to ever have overlapped with humans. And overlap they very probably did. Humans may have showed up on Australia around 60,000 years ago, and by 40,000 years ago Procoptodon fossils stopped showing up. This coincidence, as well as suspiciously similar correlations across the planet, had led to some people suggesting that these two conditions are related. The next animal on our list most definitely did engage with humans because it shows up in prehistoric folklore. Another Australian monstrosity was Megalania. This was the largest terrestrial lizard known, and it's thought to have been related to the largest lizards known, the mosasaurs. So it had tens, if not hundreds of millions of years of apex predator in its blood. And speaking of blood, being a varanid lizard, Megalania was most likely venomous, and its secretions, when seeped into the wounds of its victims, could have caused extensive bleeding, much in the way that the victims of Komodo dragons meet their ends today. And the Komodo dragon is thought to be the closest relative of Megalania, only the latter was over 7 meters long, and Megalania possibly met its demise on account of it looking to humans much in the way that humans look to straight-tusked elephants. If Komodos are anything to go by, these would have been furious swarm feeders who had an every lizard for itself kind of attitude and a very nasty bite. Coupled with a skin that you could sharpen a knife on, Megalania might have been the closest thing that humans ever had to a real dragon. We're going to be firmly stuck in Australia for the remainder of this list. And that's because, much like Madagascar and South America, its fauna evolved in isolation from much of the rest of the world. But more than this, Australian fauna represents some of the really old-fashioned evolutionary strategies that more or less died out everywhere else. Take marsupials, for example. They put barely any effort into gestation, and their offspring are left to climb out of the birth canal after just a few weeks, like creepy little half-formed fetuses, and make their own way up into the pouch to suckle. This is pretty cool as an approach when your environment is awash with monster lizards and giant kangaroos, and a big fat baby belly would just be a very expensive gamble. But our penultimate member of this list is perhaps one of the strangest animals there ever was. While Procoptodon, with its short face and Netherlands-grade height, was a very weird sort of kangaroo, it still was not as weird as Propleopus. Because Propleopus was a carnivorous kangaroo. These rare extinct marsupials lived in Australia during the Pleistocene, and are part of the same family as modern tree kangaroos and rat kangaroos, which even today are still the weird branch of the kangaroo line. But in the late Pleistocene, Propleopus oscillans was showing us that kangaroos can always go weirder. It's only known from fragmentary remains, but of those remains, there are teeth designed for cutting meat. So this killer kangaroo is somehow more upsetting than a giant Komodo dragon, and at up to an estimated 70 kilograms in weight, it makes you wonder if there will one day be fossils of kangaroos as large as Procoptodon and as bitey as Propleopus. And our last entry on the top 10 today is weird for similar but even worse reasons. Just before we hit on that one, it's time for our predictably timed call to action. As always, if you're enjoying this video, please don't forget to cast your vote on the like button, and join the subscribers list if you haven't already. It only takes a second, and you can do it right now to pass the time while we're finishing this spiel. We'd love to have you on board, and we're really grateful for your contributions. Alright, so far humans have ploughed their way through birds as tall as elephants, elephants as tall as 2 elephants, kangaroos as tall as the Dutch, sloths and armadillos the size of family vehicles, and a real-life dragon. Not to mention a kangaroo with malicious intent. All of these monsters shared their habitats with humans, and we've hinted at the idea that all of them came off worse for it. And unfortunately, our top choice for the strangest prehistoric animals that walk the earth with humans probably disappeared much for the same reason, but it was even weirder than all of these for 2 reasons. First, this was an animal whose hunting strategy dated back to a time before even mammals, let alone humans, existed. This was one of the last members of a line of reptiles that came about before the dinosaurs. a line that once ran about on four limbs chasing down prey, a line that still exists today, but as a much more lazy and easily avoidable threat, the crocodile. So the top spot goes to Quinkana, a crocodile who could gallop. As weird as this is today, this was actually the norm for the ancestors of crocs, who dominated the Triassic landscapes chasing down early dinosaurs for so long. Since dinosaurs took over, crocs were mostly relegated to sitting in the mud waiting for food to come to them, but Quinkana didn't get this message. Until around 10,000 years ago, here was a 200 kilogram, 7-meter crocodile who you couldn't avoid simply by sending your sister-in-law to the watering hole on your behalf. Quinkana would have chased down prey like the giant wombats of prehistoric Australia, who were probably worthy of spot 11 on this list if we had one. They may or may not have interfered with humans in a predatory nature, but they certainly wouldn't win the long game. Still, being that they lasted tens of thousands of years in Australia alongside humans, they were perhaps the least likely to have been driven to extinction merely by our presence. So, in conclusion, perhaps we can take three messages from this list. The first is that prehistoric animals were really weird, and not even that long ago. The second is that we seem to have a habit of wiping them out forever, and this leads us neatly to the third. We don't have to. As modern, high-living humans, all of our gallivanting about comes at a steep cost to the environment and the animals within it. We might not personally hunt rhinos for their horns, but we do create a lot of gas from farming and dredge the oceans dry to feed our fish habit. All of this amounts to around 150 species of weird and wonderful animals going extinct every day. Given that we've only documented around 1 to 1.5 million of those potential 100 million species estimated to share our planet with us, it might be pertinent to slow all that down a little bit so that we can continue to share our Earth with strange animals, both well known and yet to be discovered. And that's all for this video. Thanks again for watching, and we'll be right back with the next one in just a few days. In the meantime, we have videos on Megalania, Procoptodon and Palaeoloxodon in our library, so please feel free to check them out while you're waiting. And we'll see you next time.